G'day, Graham Lorimer here, back for my second instalment on environmental weeds. Last time I explained how different environmental weeds have different levels of seriousness, some much more so than others. I also gave you some ecological principles to apply to work out which ones are most serious and how the different species will behave. This time, I'm going to explain a whole lot of additional factors that need to be taken into account to work out the priority to be given to any particular environmental weed problem. I've been able to identify 5 separate steps to work out the priorities. The first point is the seriousness of the environmental weed problem. What sort of impact it's having in displacing indigenous flora and fauna. The second point is how rapidly and how far the environmental weed problem is likely to spread. The third point is the tractability of the environmental weed control. That is, how effectively we can get rid of the weeds, how long-lasting the impact is going to be, and what sort of risks there are to safety or to the environment. The fourth point is what other sorts of pros and cons does a particular environmental weed have outside the environmental sphere. For example, a pine tree might be an environmental weed, but it might have historical value. Or hemlock has toxicity. The fifth point is whether there are legal obligations to remove an environmental weed or not, or whether you need a permit to get rid of it. Let's take the example of this small-leaf clematis or Clematis decipiens here. We'll go through the 5 points. Point 1, how serious is it? Well, this is a listed endangered vegetation type. And as I look at this expanse of small-leaf clematis, you can see it's really smothering vegetation and is likely to make shrubs fall over and become damaged, and it's taking up so much of the sunlight that it is adversely impacting on all of the plants and the fauna underneath them. And in fact, there are some rare plants scattered through this area. So on all of those counts, I would say that the seriousness of this particular environmental weed problem is at least moderate. Point 2 is the rate of spread of the environmental weed problem. In this case, I've watched this small-leaf clematis start from a small patch a couple of years ago and has rapidly enlarged to cover most of the ground, and it's getting larger around the edges. Also, it produces copious wind-blown seed, so particularly the ones elevated are going to be able to blow much further and create problems elsewhere. So it's serious on the spread score as well. Point 3 is how tractable the weed is to control. In this case, it can be removed without much risk to the safety of the people doing it or to the environment by manually pulling it out. I think we can do a pretty good job of that, and to have it create a lasting impact with only fairly irregular follow-up action to make sure it doesn't come back again. So I'd call this a fairly tractable environmental weed problem. Point 4 is whether there are other aspects outside the environmental area that might affect whether we deal with this. In this case, it's an attractive plant, but few people come to this part of the landscape, and so its beauty is probably not a significant factor. In some circumstances, this species will require a permit to remove it, so that needs to be taken into account. Which takes me to point 5. Are there any legal requirements to deal with this environmental weed? Not in this case. But, as I said, a permit is often required. That's because small-leaf clematis is indigenous in much of the Melbourne region, and in many cases it forms important habitat and doesn't become rampant. It's just that in some species, you can have too much of a good thing. In the last video, I mentioned burgon, wonga vine and weeping grass as other examples. And if you're uncertain whether a plant is a problem, remember Lorimer's first law of weeding. When in doubt, don't pull it out. As a counterexample, look at the panic veld grass growing underneath these cherry ballard trees. Point 1, is it serious? I'd say it's not all that serious because although it's dense, I know that even in a pristine environment, not many indigenous plants grow under cherry ballard trees. So even if we completely eradicated the panic veld grass, there wouldn't be a whole lot of indigenous flora or fauna that would benefit from it. Point 2, what about its spread? I'd say it isn't at great risk of spread, and that's because over the 30 odd years that I've been coming to this spot regularly, it hasn't spread at all from underneath the cherry ballards. That's a very common phenomenon with panic veld grass being confined underneath the cherry ballards. Ants may spread the seeds further afield, but I've never seen the panic veld grass established beyond the confines of the cherry ballards. Point 3, how tractable is it? Well, it's easy to pull out. You could use chemicals, but you can avoid the risk of using chemicals. And so you could, in principle, remove the species. Many people try and do that, but what they find is that it's only very temporary. So although it's tractable as a one-off exercise to remove it, it's not tractable in the long term. It doesn't provide any lasting benefit, and that's a real problem. Point 4, does it have redeeming qualities? I can't think of any. You might like the grass and it might provide some seeds for a few ants, but I don't see that as a big deal from a biodiversity conservation point of view. And point 5, there's no legal obligation to do anything about it. So my fellow volunteers and I have decided that there are better things for us to spend our time on to look after flora and fauna than to put a lot of effort into controlling something like this. Of course, it offends our desire to have a landscape that looks natural, and this doesn't. But that's a different issue from looking after the flora and fauna. And if we can only do one, our job as volunteers is to look after the flora and fauna. Noticed how I used the concept of passenger and driver species when I assessed the seriousness of the clematis or the panic veld grass, and also how long-lasting the control of these species would be. If I was dealing with an opportunist species like a fleabane, I'd also be thinking about whether disturbance that kept on going was going to make my efforts at control futile. You probably also noticed that I relied on quite a bit of personal experience when I assessed the different weeds. Always make the best use you can of people's experience. Discuss it with other people. And if you're still left in uncertainty, remember Lorimer's first law of weeding. When in doubt, don't pull it out. You can do far more damage by inadvertently doing something wrong. Now, being a scientist, I would love to have a formula that told me from the scores that I might give each of those 5 points what priority I should be giving to any particular environmental weed problem. Unfortunately, I don't know of any such formula. The best I can come up with is this thing called a triage matrix, which I've adapted from these guys Downey et al. This is what the triage matrix looks like. The 9 white cells contain suggested management actions in response to any particular environmental weed problem, depending on how we would characterise that problem on the left-hand side of the table and on the top row of the table. Starting with the left-hand side of the table, it says level of threat to biodiversity based on my point 1, how serious the environmental weed problem is to biodiversity, and my point 2, the potential for the problem to get worse, either by spreading or becoming denser. And we have to choose between ratings high, medium, and low. To take that example of the panic veld grass underneath the cherry ballards, I would say that the potential spread is very low because it hasn't shown any sign of moving out from under the cherry ballards for years. I'd also say that the seriousness is on the lower end of the spectrum, And that would mean that we would be looking at a management action from the lowest row of the table. And we'd choose between those three according to the tractability that's listed at the top here. That's my point 3. That is the effectiveness with which we could expect to achieve lasting environmental improvement safely to humans and the environment. Again, we have to choose between high, medium, and low. And to take that example of the panic veldtgrass again, I would say that the tractability is low, based on the fact that as long as the cherry ballarts remain, the panic veldtgrass will keep coming back each time we remove it, so we can't achieve lasting improvement. Given that I've put low as the rating both on the left-hand side and on the top, that puts it in the bottom right cell of the table. Category I, no action required until higher priorities are satisfied. To take the other example of the small-leaf clematis, that's more up this side of the table, I would say that the level of threat to biodiversity is high, based on the fact that the vegetation type is endangered. There are locally threatened plants present. They are becoming smothered, which is affecting some fauna habitat. And the rate of spread is high, based on the windblown seed and the observation that new plants keep coming up in the area. I would also say that the tractability is high there, based on the capacity to remove the small-leaf clematis using manual means quite safely and with a reasonable prospect of achieving a lasting improvement. With high on both the left-hand side and the top of the table, that gives me this response. Category A, weed management is critical, immediate, targeted, and long-term. So you can see that if I was faced between the two options of dealing with the panic veldtgrass and the small-leaf clematis, I would definitely go for the small-leaf clematis. A word of caution though, the triage matrix doesn't take into account the non-environmental attributes of a plant, such as the historical value of a pine tree, and it doesn't take into account legal requirements. I hope you'll find the triage matrix and my 5-point method of determining priorities for environmental weeds useful, as well as the ecological principles and concepts that I gave you in the previous video, as well as Lorimer's first law of weeding. That's the end of this video, and I hope there'll be more. I'll leave you with one last look at the 5 points to work out the priority of environmental weeds.